nomadic theory, and I want you to connect nomadic theory with the idea of posthumanism. So let me make this very clear at the outset. When we come to the contemporary age, what happens is that we are actually looking forward to a very inclusive outlook, whereby we realize that we're not looking for a single point of origin or a single point of end, because we realize that there are multiplicities present. And this becomes the crux of both posthumanism as well as nomadic theory. Another way of looking at it is this way. When you think about using theory, in most academic circles, particularly in the English literature departments, we are asked to use a theory to understand and analyze or situate a particular text. But what happens is that, a text is not a very cohesive, um, unitarian concept. A text is filled with multiplicities. Like, Bakhtin has already pointed that out long time ago. The polyvalence is in a text. So the question that has arisen very most often is that, how can you use a single theory to conceptualize an entire text when there are polyvalent voices and heterogeneous voices right there within the text? Because already we have displaced the author, and you have multiple points of origin as well. Therefore, is it all right for one, to use just one theory and to conceptualize an entire text? It is from here that we move towards an understanding of theory as a nomadic one, where, the idea of a nomad is that you don't first let us position the difference between a nomad and a soldier. The soldier actually goes into battle with all the arms and ammunitions that he thinks he may need to use. The problem is that the battle is unpredictable, and he may have to use weapons that he does not have with him. The need may arise for such weapons that he has not even considered bringing with him. Or he may have weapons which he can never use in that particular battle. So that is why the soldier loses. On the other hand, a nomad doesn't believe in taking anything from one X to Y. A nomad travels, and in the course of the travel, the nomad, he or she, will gather substances as they need it, utilize those substances when the need arises, and discard it there and move on. So, this is the idea of the nomad as positioned against the concept of the soldier. So, these are abstract concepts, and Deleuze and Guattari, Karan Barad, Bruno Latour, all of these people, of course, Rosie Brandotti, all of these thinkers have spoken about the concept of a nomadic theory. Again, let me make it very clear. No, then any theory can become nomadic in approach. For example, post-colonialism or feminism or Dalit studies. I think Dalit studies has done a huge Herculean task of appropriating Western-centric theory and making it relevant for the Indian context. I would urge you to read people like Sanal Mohan, who have done, what do I say, wonderful articles based on utilizing the spatial theories put forward by Edward Soja and the rest of them from a very Western-centric perspective, and they have used it to narrate the Dalit contingency, the Dalit problems, using the idea of spatiality. So this is how appropriation takes place, and that is how a theory becomes nomadic in nature as well, where it is appropriated, removed from its, the place where it started its particular ideologies, and putting it into another context completely, and thereby the theory itself will change. Now, this was very evident in two areas. One is post-colonialism and the other is feminism. Because with post-colonialism, it was very early realized that the term itself is problematic, because you cannot use a single term to identify the experiences of all the countries that have undergone some sort of imperial rule. In much the same way, you cannot do the same thing with feminism as well. Just because Simone de Beauvoir has spoken about something, it need not be relevant to a person sitting in India. Therefore, both feminism, post-colonialism, spatiality, all these theories have been appropriated, and they have become nomadic in nature. I think if you remember Edward Said's traveling theory, you will find an early forerunner or an early understanding of how particular theory which sort of began to be spoken about in the Western countries based on certain events that happened in those regions, can be utilized in many other places also, providing that you sort of reinterpret and restructure the theory. So again, the question is, the ism, the idea of the ism, is that ism forever? Is it a common denominator that everybody has to use in a particular manner, or can that be subverted as well? And that is the starting point from which we will have to approach the concept of nomadic theory. So let's begin with a quotation from Deleuze. Deleuze said that we live today in an age of partial objects, bricks that have been shattered to bits and leftovers. We no longer believe in a primordial totality that once existed, or in a final totality that awaits us at some future date. So this is the idea, that is, there is no single point of origin and there is no single point of ending. It is just a fluid, what do I say, fluid becomings, not just being, but becomings. So a theory, we have to, I understand that a theory must not totalize, which means it should not uh, be very, very unchanging and rigid, because a theory itself is an instrument to understand multiple concepts. So it's an instrument for multiplication, you could say, and it is also multiplying itself. And it is in the nature of power to totalize, and theory by nature is opposed to power. So if you draw up a feature matrix, very simply, we can look at it this way. On one side, there is power, fascism, hegemony. On the other side, there are resistance theories. So what will happen when the resistance theory succeeds in dismantling this power structure and it erects itself in the place of power, then this theory will also become totalizing in nature. But we have to understand that if power totalizes, theory by nature is opposed to power, opposed to totalization, and therefore theory can be restructured, recontextualized, and appropriated as and when the context demands it. I think a quotation from Virginia Woolf would be very apt here, because that's a very old, from very old text. As a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. As a woman, my country is the whole world. So instead of confining a theory to a specific time, a specific context, we realize that a particular idea can be used in different contexts in different ways. So feminism need not always be what Simone de Beauvoir has spoken about or Kate Millett has spoken about. It can be different for different women living in different parts of the world. Deleuze and Guattari have been very eager and enthusiastic propagators of a micro-politics. So again, we come towards this idea. You're not looking at grand narratives, you're not looking at macro level narratives, you're looking at micro-politics, you're looking at minor narratives or minor literatures, as Deleuze has said. So they anticipate a new existence, a new mode of existence where individuals overcome repressive modern forms of identity to becoming desiring nomads in a constant process of becoming and transformation. So this is the idea that I wanted to speak about. I think I did mention this yesterday also. The basic idea is that, are we beings or are we becomings? Now, this is something I addressed when I spoke about Hiromi Goru's story, where evolution is arrested by the medical discourse. So the concept is that, once we decide that the body that we have now, the body that the human being has now, is the final stage of evolution, it is then that we become human beings. Otherwise, we are merely human becomings. When we admit that we are human becomings, we are existing in limbo. We are existing in the flux of change, and therefore there is no certainty about anything. We are also in a state of flux. We are also subject to change. That is the feeling that arises, and therefore we will be unwilling to underscore the finality of everything, and to insist that theory begins like this. Therefore, theory has to continue in that way and take us to a particular end. That is not the way things are. This realization comes from the looking at the trajectory of religions in one sense. For example, let's take a very safe religion, which I don't think anybody here practices. Perhaps let's look at the idea of Buddhism. Buddhism began as a reaction against the ritualistic fundamentalism of Hinduism. But what happens in Buddhism is that if it began as a reaction against rituals, it itself creates its own rituals after a while, and it becomes very, very hierarchical after a while. So we realize that any theory, once it time goes on, it becomes something else. But to insist that you take it to its pre-lapsarian purity and singularity, that is an absurd matter, and that is not going to be possible. So that is the basic idea which we are trying to convey when we talk about either posthumanism or nomadic theory. So nomadic theory is a particular mode of thinking that will help us to be able to understand the aesthetical concepts put forward by posthumanism, the narratives put forward by posthumanism, and not only posthumanism. If you go into the era which speaks about humanism itself, you can actually use the idea of a nomadic theory in order to conceptualize the basic understandings of put forward in these texts. So let us look at the word nomad. And again, I think at the cost of repeating myself, I've also said that many writers use specific words in different ways. Therefore, you have a Derridian dictionary. Derrida uses oft used words in a completely different way. So he loads it with a particular type of meaning. In much the same way, there is a Deleuze and Guattari dictionary as well, where Deleuze and Guattari use words which are very familiar to us, but they load it or they project it in a very different way. To understand that, we need to sort of go into their works and play with the word. So do not assume that you know this word and therefore this is the exact way in which Derrida is using it or Deleuze is using it. No, they sort of restructure the meaning of the word to suit the particular context that they are using it. So, yeah, where is this slide? The word nomadic is related to the peculiar way that they use the etymology of the word. Now, Deleuze and Guattari trace the meaning of the word back to the ancient Greek word nemo, Nemo, or I distribute. So, this is the root of the word nomas, which means roaming, roving, wandering to find pastures for sheep or cattle, and thus it is a precursor to the modern word nomad. And this is indicative of the way Deleuze and Guattari use the term in their work. So I hope you understand, somebody who's roaming to gather food for their flock, and they don't have any preconceived notions about the terrain that they are venturing into. So the basic idea of the nomad is, so if you are making up a feature matrix, number one, the nomad enacts transitions, which is enacts change, accepts change, flows with the flow, and there is no teleological purpose, which means there is no final end in view when the nomad sort of looks at this. So the rhizome is a root that grows underground. That's a very, very iconic use of the concept of the rhizome that Deleuze has done. And it grows in multiple directions. And Deleuze places the rhizome against the linear root of trees. By extension, the rhizomatic mode expresses a non-phallogocentric way of thinking. So I hope you remember, Derrida also speaks about the phallocentric way and the non-phallocentric way, the logos, the phallos and the logos. One is masculine oriented, the other is based on the idea of fixity. So this is a non-phallogocentric way of thinking. It is lateral, it is spreading, and it is opposed to the vertical ramifications of Western trees of knowledge. So if you had people who were well versed in Indian logic and all that, perhaps they would say that, you had this in India much before. But then we were not given that much training in that sort of Indian thinking, and therefore we are still looking towards the West and then trying to find out how they have developed it now. Next, by extent, so we have fixed the etymology of the word, or tried to fix the etymology of the word, and we have sort of positioned it against the vertical ramifications of the Western tree of knowledge. Now let us see how we can extend this. it is not, what do I say, when you think of a political ontology, it provides movable foundations for a post-human view of subjectivity. So again, the idea of the subjectivity, which is put through flux, which is becoming liminal, and therefore you have only movable foundations, which means there is nothing steady on which you can build, because the idea of steadiness is a very arbitrary concept. So nomadic consciousness, we can say, is a political resistance to hegemonic views of subjectivity which are exclusive in nature. So these are the words which are treated to be wrong. It is exclusive thinking, hegemonic thinking, the idea of unified subjecthood. All these are positioned on one side of the feature matrix, and on the other, you have these liberatory ideas, which is lateral, which is spreading, and which is, it is a resistance movement against any sort of hegemony. So certain writers like Bradotti have also said that the nomadic consciousness can be compared to what Foucault at one point of time called the counter memory. So again, see, this is not very simple or something which is not in your face to understand. It is only an understanding which comes from reading these different writers. And again, there are different writers who have given ideas at different points of times in their lives. And the idea of memory and the idea of counter memory. Again, when we think of memory, we link it to testimonial narratives, we link it to trauma. And again, we have to understand that when we talk about memory, again, there is a politics involved in the memory. What a nation remembers. What is a nation allowed to remember? And certain types of memories are validated, and certain types of memories are pushed to the forefront. If you look at any sort of power struggle between different types of memories regarding a single event, you will realize how political memories are. You look at the great discussions that are going on regarding the 1921 rebellion in Kerala. You have multiple memories contesting. All right, and certain memories are given validation at some point of time. Certain other type of memories are given validation at another point of time, and there is consistent argument. So this happens, and Foucault talks about a counter memory. A counter memory may act as a resistance against the hegemonic idea of the power structure, which validates a particular memory and says that this is the truth. And that is exactly what is history. So again, if you have read Nietzsche, Genealogy and History, written by Foucault, you will remember how genealogy is pushed forward as a gray area, where there are multiple ideas coming into being, and it is just not one single unitary idea that is projected as history. Because history can be looked at in different ways. One is that an event which has happened, fine. The event has happened, there is no denial there. But the causes and the results vary from context to context. And that is where there are multiple memories which are produced, and each memory may become a contesting site to another memory. And this is what Foucault tries to talk about when he speaks about counter memory. Again, it is resisting. Counter memory resists assimilation into the dominant ways of representing the self. So perhaps feminists or other post-colonial or Dalit intellectuals are nomadic subjects, perhaps, and they are those who have forgotten to forget the injustice and symbolic poverty. Their memory is activated against the stream. They enact a rebellion of subjugated knowledges. And this becomes very clear when you read Dalit narratives in India, because we realize that for a long period of time, there was no inclusion of Dalit narratives in the syllabi. There was, and that was occluded completely. So there are certain groups of people who cannot afford to forget. There is no gender-based history, there is no Dalit history, and therefore these people who have been excluded from the mainstream, they will, what do I say? They will keep on resisting. They will keep on resisting the mainstream, and it is their responsibility to keep on resisting to find lost voices. For example, when there is a project called megaphone.net, MEGAFONE, megaphone.net on the internet. I don't think it is active now, but for I mean, till 2017 or 18, it was very active. So megaphone.net is a website that gathers gender narratives. And anybody can actually record your voice and post it on this website. And it becomes an archive of memories of people who do not have the space for their memories to be included in the mainstream narratives. So most often when you look at historical narratives, they are all war-based narratives. Museums are also focusing on war and kings. The narratives of ordinary people, the narratives of multiple genders, the narratives of caste-based, what do I say, um, marginalized people, all these narratives are uprooted from the mainstream. So these people, all these marginalized people speak from the periphery, the precariats, and that becomes a counter memory. So Foucault theorizes that when institutions of power systematically censor the expressions and ideas of other groups with lesser power, these ideas become subjugated knowledge. So I hope you understand. So one is their projected knowledge, and other is subjugated knowledge. So intellectuals who conform to the dominant historical narratives conceal these particular blocks of historical knowledge. So it is through the critique of such forms of subjugated knowledge that we can begin to unearth or rediscover previously discredited historical contents and move forward to build a more complete understanding of history, which is a knowledge of multiple struggles and multiple resistances which took place over time. So when these memories are used to modify our interpretation of history, it constructs a counter memory, a transformation of history into a totally different form of time. So counter memory is a reconstitution of history, not a rejection of history. I think I will give you one example which will make it clear to you. Rather, I mean, instead of going on talking, I can give you a concrete example. There is, maybe some of you are already familiar with this young academic in Kerala. His name is Vinil Paul. He's a JNU scholar, and he's done commendable work on Dalit studies. Okay, and he's actually spoken about slavery which existed in India based on caste. So I don't know if anybody of you young students would have learned about caste-based slavery in India. But this existed. I'm not sure about other parts of India because each particular area will have its own narratives. But in Kerala, it was very clearly found that there were castes which were, and the people of these castes were treated as slaves. So Dr. Sanal Mohan has done huge amount of research there, and so has Vinil Paul. So if you search for them on Google, you will find their articles at least. And it is said that, the basic idea of slavery is that you have no agency. And secondly, there is no concept of family, because a family and antenatal separation is a common feature of slavery. So this has been established by Vinil Paul, and he says that certain castes in Kerala, they were allowed to be bought and sold by the landowners. I hope you get the context. So this is a memory which we are not familiar with. This is a counter memory. And once this counter memory is projected, then our very easy understanding of history becomes a problem. And then we start thinking about, the idea of independence and how the entire people of India joined together to fight British. But at the same time, there was another struggle going on here. But it is only when we read such texts that are not really focused upon in the dominant historical narrative that we get an idea of how many counter memories there are and how many counter memories were allowed to flourish. And I think, another example would be the way Spivak has dealt with the concept of sati. When we were in school, we were always taught that, the British, on the advice of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, stopped sati, and there was a huge service done to Indian women. What was not explained, and what we later learned from Gayatri Spivak, was that sati was not practiced in many parts of India. It was only practiced in a particular region, in a particular tribe. But that becomes an icon to justify or validate the entire project of imperialism. So that is another counter memory. So I hope you have understood what I am trying to say. So even within a literary text, there are these actions of counter memories. So Deleuze and Guattari seek to decode the libidinal flows initiated by these dynamic. And their work is less a critique of knowledge and rationality than of capitalist society. And they clearly address the importance of macro structures as well and develop a detailed critique of the state. So, the idea of the schizoid and schizophrenic destruction I've already explained. So, in thousand plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari differentiate between migrants and nomads. It's a spectrum. So, think of a spectrum, and that is used to describe everything from political systems to psychology, and using a couple of different terms. So, these are the terms that they have used. Again, if you draw up a feature matrix, on one side you will have the macro political, the molar, MOLAR, the major, and the territorialized. I hope you have understood these terms. The molar, the major, the macro political, the territorialized. These are determined, ordered, categorized. Again, do remember what I have already spoken about regarding chaos. Chaos is not something bad because chaos produces organic thinking. Chaos produces a relentless revision of hegemony. All right. So on one side, you have these are negative terms according to Deleuze. The macro political, territorialized, where the territory is very, very fixed. The molar and the major. On the other hand, from the molar, the opposite is the molecular. And the major, you have the minor. From macro political, you have the micro political. And from territorialized, you have deterritorialized. And this is free, it is chaotic, it is unspecified. I hope you have understood the two concepts. So always when you think of these terminologies, I would urge you to draw up these flow charts or feature matrices and place it on either side. Then the connection becomes very, very clear. And reterritorialization is exactly what Arundhati Roy has used in her book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, because spaces which are regarded as negative spaces which are regarded with fear have been re-territorialized as places which are safe, which give you security, which allow you to pursue your identity in multiple ways, in any way you want to. And that is why I feel that this text has not been discussed enough. And this text, I think, for 15 years, people are expecting Arundhati Roy to come up with the second version of The God of Small Things. And she comes up with something completely different, quite difficult rather, and not very entertaining. And that is why the book was not taken up for much discussion. But I always believe that from the Indian context, re-territorialization, deterritorialization, all these things are very clearly, brilliantly portrayed in the Ministry of Utmost Happiness. If you care to read that once more, with the background knowledge afforded by Deleuze and Guattari, the tools of analysis afforded by Deleuze and Guattari, that would become a very fruitful reading. So the next concept, like we spoke about the soldier and the nomad, the migrant and the nomad, and let us look at two orders: the sedentary order and the nomadic order. The sedentary order, where you're fixed in space, and when you look at that, you can think of the use of space and the relation of a person to the land that they inhabit. So let us again think about spatial theory here. You have any number of writers like Lefebvre, like Edward Soja. Homi Bhabha also has used certain terminologies of spatial theorists. You have all these people who have utilized or projected the concept. I think it begins with Foucault almost, where you talk about space and your relationship with space in order to understand certain dynamics of relationships. Again, if you look at Hinduism and the way the hierarchy of the caste is arranged, space is a very important concept there. For example, your access to the temple actually determines the hierarchy of your caste, where you stand on the caste ladder. And again, spaces were very important in the public domain and the private domain. And in the public domain, how many people had access to the public domain? At what time did they have access? Like after 6 o'clock, how many people had access to the public domain? What did it depend on? Did it depend on your caste? Did it depend on your gender? All these are questions that need to be raised. In much the same way, Deleuze and Guattari are also using space to reconceptualize your understanding of your position in a society or your attitude depending on your the relationship that you have with the space that you inhabit. So one is sedentary and the other is nomad. The nomad recurs, all right. So what they're doing is they're trying to position different ideas of space against the idea of the nomad, and thereby to make you understand the concept of the nomad that they have put forward. So sedentary people that do not move. Okay, again, you can read a lot into this. You can read diaspora, you can read the idea of the migrant, you can read the idea of the refugee as well. But all these people have different connections with space, different connections with the land that they inhabit. And Baba has also made extensive use of the idea of space when he talks of third space in a very different way from the way Edward Soja does. For him, the third space becomes a place where multiples come together, and there is a new identity, a very hybrid identity that comes out. So that is on one side. All these ideas are there. On the other side, let us look at what Deleuze and Guattari have said about space. So, yeah, a sedentary and nomadic. Okay, under the sedentary order, which is very clearly projected with the agricultural land, distinct parcels of land are distributed to determined groups of people. Areas of land are divided, demarcated in order that the ownership of the land is clear. Any movement across this land is defined by borders and boundaries. I hope that you will connect it to all the other concepts that I've spoken about. Nationalism. You bring in Benedict Anderson. You think of diaspora, you think of migrants, you think of refugees. All these people encounter borders and boundaries. So these are people who think about land from a sedentary perspective. And for them, lands are parcels, like squares, like the fields that you see from a railway train or something like that. And they're distributed to determined groups of people. You can also think of it when you think of the dispossessed people, when you think of ethnic people, when you think of aborigines. They are not sedentary people, but they are coming into contact with a sedentary idea of land when they have no idea about the sedentariness associated with the concept of land, because they wander from place to place looking at the particular terrain which is suitable for them. So if you think of all these different types of people, categories of people, and then you try to associate it with the sedentary notion of land and the nomadic notion of land, I think it will become very clear. So when you move from point A to point B, roads and walls, checkposts, passports, all these things will determine the route that you are supposed to take. In contrast, under the nomadic order, which is exemplified by the image of the desert, I hope you understand. On one hand, you have the agricultural land, which is sedentary, connected with sedentariness, which is connected with order, which is connected with categorization and hierarchy. The nomadic order is exemplified by the image of the desert. A number of people, and again, I do not know how I can tell you this. Do not just imagine that they're talking about agriculture and desert. No, these are abstract concepts, and we have to use these concepts in order to understand our approach to literature as well. So, in the nomadic order, a huge number of people are scattered across an expanse of land. There is no clear border or exclusive ownership. The route from point A to point B is not determined in the same way as under the sedentary order. Rather, stopping places are subordinated to the journey itself. So you have meeting places, you have encampments, you have watering holes instead of cities and borders and boundaries. So if there is water, many people will come there. They will use the water and they will go their own way. So this is the idea of the nomadic concept. Do not just fix it with this idea, but use it to think about multiple other contexts as well. It can be used in politics, it can be used in literature. So the nomad then, we very clearly understand, is an inverse of the sedentary model. Land is not distributed to the people, rather people are distributed on the land. And it also implies a profound difference in the relationship to the place that one occupies at any given point of time. So the land does not belong to the people belong to the land. Again, you can rethink our ideas of eco-criticism, our idea of deep ecology, our idea of, I'm sorry, somebody has raised your hands. Namrata, is there something you want to ask? Hello? Shall I continue? Was that a mistake? I don't know. Anyway, the nomadic distribution is not undertaken through distribution of land but through movement. So, traveling is a default mode of relating to space. Again, when you think of nomads, don't imagine that they're always traveling. It is their attitude to land that is being spoken about. Some people may stay in one place for a long time. Perhaps they may remain there till their death. But their relationship to the place they occupy is intermediate or secondary to the principle of movement. What that they mean to say is their relationship is uh, they do not become defined by the place, and they do not differ in their relation to the land from those around them who do travel. Under the nomadic order, everyone is a nomad whether they move or not. I hope you have understood. That is, even if you are not moving, even if you are sedentary, you are stuck in a place till your death. Your relationship to the land can define you as a nomad. Because if you do not let this particular piece of land define you or project you in a particular way, where you're very rooted to this land, you are completely disconnected. You are a cosmopolitan person, or you are a citizen of the world, or you don't feel attached to any particular place. Then you can be a nomad, even though you stay in a specific place from your birth to your death. Again, if you think of all the novels which have projected space, you will understand that different characters will have different approaches to the idea of space. And perhaps the first differentiation that we got was people who move and people who are stuck in a place. And even within people who are stuck in a place, we realize that even they can be nomads depending on their understanding and their relationship to a piece of land. And here again, we call into question the idea of nostalgia, memories connected to a particular land, the idea that space defines a person. All these things can be taken into question. Again, we have to think about, when did space become a defining concept? Because during the hunter-gatherer age, everybody was wandering in search of food. There was no particular connect to a particular space. It is with agriculture that this happens. It is with agriculture capitalism. But with globalization, again, there is a free flow of human beings from one space to another. And if the human being is not connected to the space that he is inhabiting, he can very well be called a nomad in the vocabulary of Deleuze and Guattari. Now, um, movement is what happens in between residing in specific places. There is thus a difference between those who stay in one place and those who do not. Now, those who move under the sedentary order are different, and they are called migrants. In order to differentiate them from those who do not move, let me just explain this. That is, within the nomadic order, you have people who do not move, but because they are not defining their identity in connection to the space, they are still called nomads. On the other hand, there are people who are sedentary, but they might move. This movement is called migration because they move across the land according to the sedentary model of distribution of land. And that is where this idea of diaspora, nostalgia, going back to one's roots come in. Because the idea of roots is very clearly there. The nomad doesn't think about roots. So he or she is different from the non-migrant who stays put in their respective territory. Now, a nomad, on the other hand, is anyone that lives in an area where the population is distributed according to the nomadic principle, whether they are moving or not. So, being a nomad is a matter of relating to space and land in an entirely different way than either the migrant or the non migrant. This is precisely why it is an idea that is useful for debates about migration, debates about the refugee crisis, debates about countries that take in people and countries that refuse. So let us now actually place this concept within the much celebrated phenomenon of globalization. because when we think about uh, contemporary world, there are certain concepts that we cannot divorce ourselves from. One of which is globalization and technology. Like we spoke at length about technology today, and globalization is accelerated due to technology. Let me just give you an example. Like it's Zizek's example. It's a brilliant example of what he calls. What Robert Samuels has actually put forward this concept of auto modernity. Okay, so Samuels talks about auto modernity, where he foregrounds technology. And he says that from postmodern, we have moved into auto modernity because everything is decided by technology. And Zizek has an example here. Zizek says that, when you get inside a lift, an escalator, an elevator, not an escalator, in an elevator, there is a button which says close. Whether you press the button or not, the door will close. So, why is there a button? Zizek says that the button is there to give you the illusion of being in control. So that is just an idea about auto modernity and the idea of technology. So within globalization, when we talk about globalization, what creates globalization in one sense is technology. Look at imperialism. When you think of the imperial enterprise, the reason why it happened was because of maritime travel. If travel had not been there, or the early rudiments of technology of communication had not been there, imperialism would not have been possible. In much the same way, newer modes of technology have facilitated the spread and the growth of globalization. So, the much celebrated phenomenon of globalization combines new technologies, new economy, new lifestyle, new generations of both human as well as technological gadgets, new types of wars, and new weapons with complete social rejection of change and transformation. So, on the surface, they reject change, they reject transformation. Because what type of change are they rejecting? They are rejecting the questioning of capitalism. They are rejecting the question of hierarchy. But at the same time, there are many other changes that globalization believes in. In a totally schizophrenic double pull, the consumerist and socially enhanced faith in what is new is supposed not only to fit in with, but also actively induce the rejection of in depth changes. Now, this is a point that I urge you to think about a little deeply, because it's called a double bind or a double pull, a schizophrenic double pull where two things exist at the same time. That's schizophrenia, right? Where you hear voices inside your head and you have multiple realities. All right, so that is another area connected with psychoanalysis and all that. I'm not going into that now. But what I'm trying to look at is the idea of the schizoid as put forward by Deleuze and Guattari. So there is this double bind here. Globalization believes in new technology, new wars between two multinational companies and all that. But at the same point of time, they do not wish to bring in any new sort of change in the social hierarchical order or the hegemony that is brought in by such structures. So at the same time, they are accepting the new, but they're rejecting it when it doesn't suit them. So revolutions are not acceptable. Social revolutions are not acceptable. Challenging of capitalism is not acceptable. What is acceptable is anything that accelerates capitalism, anything that accelerates takeover by economies, or taking over a country or a particular company. It's both become almost the same. So this is potentially uh, um, deterritorializing. And the new technology is hampered and tuned down by the reassertion of the gravitational pull of old and established values. So if you look at it, on one hand, you have accelerated change, and on the other hand, the hierarchy remains the same. Almost the feudal structure is still in place, where you have the owner and the worker, and the completely, what do I say, disengaged uh, worker separated from his surroundings, alienated from the modes of production. You have that on one side, and on the other, you have accelerated change as well. And this is why it is called potentially deterritorializing the idea of change itself. And the old values are not very good, but these old values still hold uh, power. So you have convergences, information, biotechnology, genetic engineering, and this is one of the major social manifestations of the current status of the subjects in advanced post-industrial societies as they are in a state of dispersion and fragmentation. Um, Let us see. So the next concept is analyzing capitalism itself as schizophrenia. The political climate of this historical context can be summed up again in Deleuze's words as capitalism as schizophrenia. This is again a double pull in contemporary cultures as a conflict between, on one hand, the rising demand for singularity or autonomy, and on the other hand, the re-territorialization of desire for a commercial profit. And this is reflected in the schizoid paradox of the compulsive consumerism of mass culture, where all emphasis falls on the quest for personalized, itemized, custom made specifications and commodities. So, on one hand, you have mass production and technologies that are focusing on mass production. But even within the mass production, the elite class demands something which is personalized, something which is branded, something that can make them stand apart from the rest of the order. This is what they call capitalism as schizophrenia. And while insisting on mass production, it also makes sure that more money is gained by making people feel that they're special when they spend money in a particular way to buy a particular commodity. And this is where Marx's commodity fetish becomes very, very relevant. And there is no going past that idea at all. So, this actually achieves a disastrous dual effect. It reasserts individualism as the unquestionable, desirable standard. At the same time, it reduces it to brand names and to logos. So, I remember there's a book called 100 Hours with Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro, when he was alive, he was asked this question: what do you think of brands? You know, this Prada, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, all these brands. So, uh, I suppose all of you know who Castro was, one of the last communist leaders. Okay, and Castro replies that branding is a very devious manipulation by the West to make the youth of poor countries feel that they have been deprived of something. So I think we spoke about this yesterday also when we talked about high tech, high technology, where technology and aesthetics are combined. You might be wondering why, in a class of literature, we need to talk about all these things. We need to talk about all these things because unless and until we know the context in which a literary text is produced, we will not be able to address this text. And another thing is that our idea of texts are also changing. We're no longer talking about a printed text. We're talking about liminal texts which are found on the computer screen, a text which keep on changing, altered by technology, altered by people. So when the next generation starts reading, their idea of reading will be completely different. And unless and until we factor in technology and the politics of technology, reading will be incomplete. And that is the reason why I keep talking about this. I don't know when digital humanities will become a paper in Kerala or in, I don't know which universities you come from. I do not know about all that. But it is definitely that is the country of the future. And unless and until we equip ourselves with all that, we are still left looking at the moon that Shelley was looking at. Not that it is a bad thing to do, but we have to look around ourselves also. So it pushes the commercial profit making to the innermost boundaries of subjectivity. And therefore, instead of saying I think, therefore I am, it is I shop, therefore I am. And this is very evident in the social media platforms, in advertising the self, in the narcissistic narratives that we indulge in. So that is also a text. With these blogs become a text. How much of you are you putting out as content? How are you? See, earlier uh, you have the producer, the person who made the text or made the film or whatever, and you had the consumer. Two distinct personalities. What you now have on social media is what do I say? A configuration of two elements. A prosumer. You are a producer and a consumer at the same time. So each time you use Instagram, you're being both a consumer as well as a producer. So these are identities that have, which will be very, very relevant. So if Roland Barthes speaks about the death of the author, it is about time that people in the literature department looked at prosumers and the type of content that they are putting forward, instead of insisting that students only look at a text written in the printed form and that should be taken up for research. Absurd that is. Now, uh, Kate Ansel Pearson has argued that grand narratives have come back into fashion. How? And what is a grand narrative that has come back into fashion? It's not religion, perhaps, or it is not any sort of idealism like Marxism, but it is a grand narrative that stresses the current evolution of human species through interface with intelligent machines. So that is the transhumanism, like I said, where you believe that you can go on perfecting the human body. That has become a grand narrative. And there is a new mythology of the machine that is emerging, and it finds expression in current claims that technology is simply the pursuit of life by means other than life. So this is very politically naive, according to Kate Pearson, as it rests on a very simplistic model of biotechnological evolution. So, such grand narratives reflect the dynamics of contemporary hyper-colonialist capitalism, that which conflates with change with novelty, speed with simple acceleration. All right, and this is what Donna Haraway has called the informatics of domination. So, if you even look at cyberspace, cyberspace was supposed to be, a sort of utopian space where the public domain would be of easy access to everybody. But we clearly understand that the cyberspace is not safe for many people. It's gender based. Safety is gender based. The safety is based on many other things. Therefore, the utopian dream that was put forward by cyberspace actually, in the long run, becomes a very exclusive space altogether. And that is one reason why Donna Haraway has called it the informatics of domination. So, and please remember that, on one hand, you have post-humanism and one part is transhumanism, and this great dependence on the machine and this valorizing the machine. That is what is looked upon with skepticism by people like Rosie Bradotti. And therefore, she says that I want to stress the relevance of a materialist, nomadic philosophy of becoming as an alternative conceptual framework in the space service of a sustainable future. I'll just give you one example here, which may make this clear to you. If you go online, there are any number of YouTube videos. There's also a book written by this person, Villoria. All right. So Villoria is an intersex person, which means, if you were to use an Indian term, what we call hijra. They're born with both the vagina and the phallus. And Villoria says that a medical discourse intervenes with such people very brutally, because the moment the baby is born and they find these defining features which are quite ambiguous, the medical people determine or are insistent that they conduct surgeries and make sure that the baby is either male or female. Villoria says that you should not intervene. There is medical intervention, surgical intervention should not be done. It is brutal. She says, she refers to herself as she, because she says that's how I was brought up, and I sort of think of myself. I use the pronoun she. So Villoria says she's against any kind of surgical interventions, because such babies have the right to live as fluid gender persons, where they can take up any gender role they want to. The question is, how can the medical discourse take on the authority to determine the sex of the baby through surgical intervention? That is the question that is Villoria is raising. So I hope you can understand this. Intersex people, of people of fluid gender, how their lives are being intervened using technology. I hope you understand. So on one hand, you have the nomad, where people are happy to exist in fluidity. People are happy to exist moving between different zones, not bothering about boundaries, because there are no boundaries for them. The entire body is field where free play. Again, come back to Arundhati Roy. She says about the people living in the graveyard. say that, we are India and Pakistan. There are no boundaries in our body. I hope you understand the context of the nomad in this connection. On the other hand, you have technology. Technology becomes an informatics of domination, deciding exactly what a person should be, because they are falling back upon the validation given to them by scientific knowledge, and they pretend that this knowledge is final, teleological. This is the end. They never gives room for space to wonder whether this is just a contingent idea regarding the human body, that this idea is fluid, this idea can change. And Villoria says that surgery becomes brutal because it doesn't stop with one surgery. The human body grows. As a child, it grows. And at each stage, different surgeries are necessary once you go in for the surgical room. So these are things that we have to think about and bring that into context when we think about the nomad, when we think about the sedentary people. I hope you have now understood the differentiation. So the word transpositions is another word commonly used when we talk about nomadic theory. This term has a double source of inspiration from both music and from genetics. And it is intertextual. There is a cross boundary or transversal transfer in the sense of a leap from one code, field, or axis or to another, not merely in the question of multiplications, but in a sense of complex multiplicity. So we're talking about transposition. So transpositions, I mean, using all these terms so that we get a wider idea of what it means to think in terms of a nomadic structure. It's not a matter of weaving together different strands, but of playing on the positivity of difference as its specific themes. So these are the idea. It refers to process of genetic mutation, transferring of genetic information which can occur in a non-linear manner, which is perhaps random, perhaps arbitrary. So it's like that. So this is in opposition to a mainstream scientific vision that tends to define the gene as a steady entity that transmits fixed units of heredity in an autonomous self manner. And this is where, the idea of feminism also comes in, where you look at feminism from a point of view of the brain structure, the cells, and you're talking about, women behaving in a particular manner and men behaving in another manner. So neurofeminism as well as nomadic theory has questioned the gene as something that is very steady, that transmits a particular hereditary factor from one person to another. All right, transpositions. Now let us look at transpositions in literature. So transposition then becomes a genre in the work of literature that retains the first story or the earlier story, or the original story, if you want to call it that, but changes its content when the past and present contexts are incompatible. So a traditional American translation, example that is a traditional American translation of a poem, Pushkin's poem called Gypsies, will reproduce the form and content of the original in English within the context of 19th century. An adaptation, perhaps in America, will often add or eliminate segments in the process of changing the medium. An American transposer will integrate each segment of the poem into an English language narrative like a translator, but align the content with the context that is located in the United States at the beginning of the 21st century. Another very an easier example would be using the movie Clueless. The movie Clueless is based on Jane Austen's Emma, but it is completely different because it takes place in Beverly Hills in California, and the discourse is Hollywood in nature, not England that Jane Austen was talking about. So this is transposition and adaptation, which perhaps could be called tradaptation. Now, let me just go back a bit and try to explain this. Yeah, the idea is that, in oral narratives, there was no original author. And if you look at A.K. Ramanujan's multiple Ramayanas, study of multiple Ramayanas, we realize that the context would have decided the character. The context would have slightly altered the story as well. For example, Tulsidas wrote the Ramayana at the peak of the Bhakti movement. So Valmiki's Rama was quite human in nature. The Ramayana written by Tulasidas, Ramacharita at the peak of Bhakti movement is the Ram is very divine. The Ram in Tulasidas is very divine. There is no, he's not, doesn't have any human failings or foibles. Whereas in Valmiki's Ramayana, that is not the case. So this was there in the oral tradition, which is coming back in a new form, and it is being called adaptation or both translation as well as adaptation, adaptation, transpositions, and such terminologies are given. Um, so Bradotti, coming back to Bradotti, she in an article titled "The Becoming Minoritarian of Europe," she says, fear, anxiety, and nostalgia are clear examples of negative emotions involved in the project of detaching ourselves from familiar forms of identity. Achieving a post-national sense of identity requires the disidentification from established nation-bound points of reference. So again, the idea of a nation, which is categorized, which is very clearly fixed. There are boundaries, there are certain colors associated, there are certain emblems, symbols. All these things refer to a sedentary mode. And a post-national sense would talk about re-territorializing the self and not having a fixed space to which you can bind your identity to. So Bradotti looks at the European Union in this manner, and she says that it is theoretically aligned with the strain of 20th century continental philosophy of deconstruction that aims to undo the grand narratives of traditional ideas of the self and identity. Perhaps I might take a couple of minutes here to look at the idea of Europe and the EU. If we remember, I mean, you remember British history, all these countries, England, I mean, England is not in the EU, but England very clearly is an ally. So the European Union, which has completely deconstructed or dismantled the idea of national identity, because these countries, which were at war, constantly at war with each other, which actually the scramble for colonies in Africa, in India, all these things have been completely dismantled now, and they are having one particular currency. They don't require visas to travel between these national boundaries. So an entire edifice has crumbled. And the theater of war, if you notice, has shifted from the west to the east, where in the east countries are constantly at war with one another. So, according to Bradotti, the European Union is a perfect laboratory for thinking up a new nomadic subject. The idea of national boundaries has been constantly questioned, revisioned. So, such a subject is one that embraces the demographic changes entailed in living in the European Union today and actively constructs itself in complex, internally contradictory set of social relations. So I hope you have understood. And the question is, the countries that are at war today in the East, what will happen to them in the future, perhaps? That is another thing that we can ask ourselves. Because if you have read the 100 Years' War and all that, you would never believe that France and England would exist in perfect and an amicable situation where you don't even require a passport to travel. So perhaps, these wars that we see today, again, these are transient, and the very ideals for which they are fought may not exist in future. So again, there is only constant change. And the idea of the nomad in that case can be read very easily in these countries, which were quite insistent on sedentariness, on the idea of migrants, on the idea of, perfect boundaries and barriers from one country to the other. In mobility studies, the figure of the nomad has also faced critical opposition because, when you think about a nomad and you start exoticizing and romanticizing the idea of the nomad, it also becomes essential in nature. So there has been criticism. But despite these problems, Deleuze and Guattari's nomadology, as it has been called, was quite fruitful because it can be used to analyze and understand the relationship between human beings in the state and the type of literature which these mobile human beings produced. So it can be used for epistemological purposes, understanding meaning, how the figure of the nomad may relate to the living nomad. So when you do the studies of war literature and all that, this nomadic figure can also be used as a trope to frame life worlds that do not fit into particular molds of national identity. So you have a constant form of othering or framing of the other. And the concept of nomadism is very metaphorical in that sense. The idea of micropolitics. So, micropolitics, we think of everything has a geography, there is a cartography, there is a diagram. So, what is interesting, even in a person, are the lines that make them up, or they make up, or take, or create. So, we look at the idea of the cartography also, geography also, and we understand that maps are also quite political in nature. So, Deleuze claims that all things and events are composed of three types of lines. First one is rigid segmentarity. These are the great segments of the rich, poor, young, old, health, sickness. Then there is the supple line, the cracks. We are the lines, the molecular fluxes, he has called it, the liminal spaces. And the third kind of line is a line of flight or rupture. So something is carried away across our segments, but also across our thresholds toward an unknown destination, not pre-existent. So again, think of it in a very metaphoric manner. Here, maybe we could also think about pure class trees, society against the state. So, class trees claim is that many of the stateless societies of the world today have survived not as a remembrance or a memory of a primitive past, but they are the result of social mechanisms that are developed and reinforced to prevent the concentration of power. So this is all that we need to understand, that there are many other groupings other than the national grouping. And again, why talk about this? Because very clearly our national sentiments often represented in literature. And that is why, Benedict Anderson calls a nation an imaginary state. I hope you remembered Adishi, Chinamanda Adishi, the purple hibiscus. So when we look at, I'm just taking a couple of examples to show how the idea of the nomad can be clearly used in understanding texts and authors. So Hadishi is a transcultural writer and is bounded by the need to illustrate issues which verge on the intolerance for people outside your ethno-cultural background. So she is a black woman living in America and she's used to facing this sort of discrimination. So Americana is a transcultural trope that appreciates the fluidity of the present age. And Edishi becomes very crucial because she doesn't write like the usual black writing that we have become used to. Edishi's writing is rather different because she talks about the confluence of global cultures, mobility, as well as nomadic nature of the 20th century human being, and to engender a culturally polyvalent society and transculturalism as well. So, the major difference between transcultural writers like Edishi and writers of literature of mobility is that their works replicate nuances of cultural transactions and transformations. Put differently, they are mobile writers who distance themselves and go beyond the politically and culturally constructed categories of the migrant writer, ethnic writer, multicultural writer, Commonwealth writer, or the Francophone writer. I hope you have understood this because we have a new genre of writings coming from mobile writers or nomadic writers like Edishi, who, if you go deep into this idea of the migrant writer or ethnic writer, who has this idea of the migrant writer often has this nostalgia for the roots, which is not to be found in Edishi. There is a very comfortable existing in different cultures in different spaces, and that is why we sort of talk about Edishi as a writer who speaks about nomadism. So, bordering on the politics of inclusion and exclusion in the face of increasing complexity in identity delineation of an individual, as a scene in this novel called Americana. So, this philosophy encompasses a redefinition of one's existence, self denial, sacrifice, or lifestyle. And the home, as constant change of location, is understood to be the home of nomads. And of course, there are certain characteristics. One is self independence and self sufficiency, and the ability to feel very comfortable in any space that you choose to inhabit at a particular point of time. And there is no yearning to go back to another space which probably defined your identity, because there is no singular identity that you are going to talk about. So one more point, and then we'll open for questions. And then there is the polyglot, the idea of a polyglot, a person who can speak many languages. The polyglot is a specialist of any language, and words have a way of not standing still, of following their own path. We realize the multiple meanings that can be associated with words. They come and go, and they leave behind sometimes graphic or unconscious traces. As in Alice in Wonderland, Humpty Dumpty very wisely reminds us all that what counts in defining the meaning of the words is who is the boss. So, what is a political ideology at a particular point of time? So, once you realize that the meaning of the word is decided by social, political factors, the polyglot is glot is a nomad in between different language banks, and he or she knows how to trust traces to resist settling into one sovereign vision of identity. I hope you can connect this to the way Deleuze and Guattari have used the word nomad itself. So there is no supervisioning of the self. The nomad stands for movable diversity. The nomad's identity itself, if you borrow this idea from Derrida, is an inventory, is a collection of traces. So the key notion to understanding multiple identity is desire. And therefore you bring in the concept of psychoanalysis as well as a philosophy of desire. So on one side you have psychoanalysis, which is a philosophy of desire, and it is also becoming a theory of cultural power. The truth of the subject is always a negotiation between the self and the society. The truth of the matter is that from the moment you were born, you have lost your origin. And language is the medium and the site of constitution of the subject. It follows that it is also the capital of our culture, and this is a very ambiguous concept. So the polyglot uh, very clearly understands the arbitrariness of language, which Sajot was talking about. And writing for the polyglot is a process of undoing the stability of fixed identities. So writers can be polyglot within the same language. Again, the play, like a nomad can be a nomad even without moving. So in much the same way, you speak English and you write many different Englishes from all over the world. Like look at Kachru, and Kachru's idea of multiple Englishes from all over the world. So you are a polyglot in the same language, because you have Jane Austen's English, you have Virginia Woolf, you have James Joyce. They invented different dialects. Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Jeet Thayil, they're all writing in English, but then you're becoming a polyglot in a particular language itself, and that becomes writing. So the polyglot writer doesn't want mainstream communication, and that longs instead for areas of silence and radical non-belonging and radical outsideness. And that is where Deleuze talks about something called minor literature, where minor literature is not literature written by the minorities, but the idea that you linguistically minorize a major language. It can be very clearly found in dialectical writing. So minor literature can be a literature written in a dialect as well, because we realize that, when you look at literature, a particular dialect is supposed to be, particular in regional writing, one dialect gains a superior notion, and that dialect is used very often. But nowadays, many new, dialects which are already there, but whenever used in literary writing, have come to be used very often, very commonly, and with a very clear political purpose. So these are minor writings in the mainstream literature, and this has also been associated with a nomadic way of thinking. I think I'll stop here now.